The game development company Ubisoft coming under major fire lately for the release of their up-and-coming game Assassin's Creed Shadows. Now, this isn't the first time Ubisoft has come under fire. Actually, just in the last year, they were under massive scrutiny for the release of Star Wars Outlaws. I'm not going to cover that game in this video, but let's just say it was not what people expected and not what people wanted, to say the least, especially considering its massive budget. Today, we're going to focus on specifically the Assassin's Creed series and how it relates to historical accuracy. For a game that is supposed to be historically set, many people are criticizing the inaccuracies and the errors that developers are making from early leaked footage. But are people being too harsh, and is this just a result of the culture war? Well, Ubisoft has actually been under fire for the last decade. Ever since the release of Black Flag, every subsequent Assassin's Creed game has come under major fire for one reason or another. Assassin's Creed Rogue was considered a DLC, not a standalone game. It used the exact same engine as Black Flag. Assassin's Creed Unity had major bugs on launch, and although it's been polished and is considered underrated today, it, in fact, at the time was very poorly received. Assassin's Creed Syndicate may be a solid game, but underplayed, underperforming in the market. Assassin's Creed Origins, not really even considered an Assassin's Creed game, just using the title to release an RPG. And although that game was very fun and received well, again, not considered an Assassin's Creed game. Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which we're going to talk about at length later, was poorly received because of the excess fantasy elements on top of everything else that they did that seemed to be woke or under a political agenda, which we will cover later. Assassin's Creed Valhalla very much underperforming what they expected and what they wanted. And of course, Assassin's Creed Mirage, which attempted to get back to its roots, but have they already forgotten those roots as we're getting to Assassin's Creed Shadows, which is what we're going to talk about today. So there's been a problem in the game development industry for a while, and as an indie game developer, I've been to these conferences, I've talked to some of these AAA guys, and I know the problem firsthand. It's not just speculation. The game development industry has gone under a total ideological shift in the last decade, way towards the left, way towards woke identity politics, which a lot of people and streamers have been criticizing. Is it unfair? To some degree, it could be considered unfair, but there's also a lot of warranted feedback and critiques to be had. And after all, gamers are not exactly considered massively woke, so it doesn't exactly align with the audience all the time, which we can see is a problem. There's been a ton of sensationalism even in the last year with regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but does this apply to Assassin's Creed Shadows in a historical context? Well, we're going to see. In fact, I think we should be skeptical of Assassin's Creed Shadows, but not for the sensational reasons that you might think involved with the culture war and the various news going on around it. To begin, we need to talk about historical accuracy and what it means to make a game that's historically set. Now, there are three different types of historically set games, and just generally media. First is historically accurate media. This is media that does everything it can to be by the books, exactly what primary sources say, the most plausible interpretation of history, and these media pieces are few and far in between. Almost every piece of modern media takes massive historical liberties for the sake of entertainment. Now, there are some shows and movies and games that do a better job than others, and you can find them if you want, and if that's what you enjoy, a game that's as historically accurate as possible, then you can pursue those options and enjoy that content. Most media does not come anywhere close to meet a historically accurate bar, and you can see tons of videos online of people debunking movies and TV for being historically inaccurate. Sometimes I think it's a little funny because I don't believe the media was ever attempting to be historically accurate, but that's maybe a discussion for another day. In fact, to be historically accurate, you have to rely on primary sources, but with archaeological data and new records being found all the time, these things can change. Something that's historically accurate one day could be perceived historically inaccurate the next day. History is not an exact science. In fact, it's not a science at all. It's its own field of study that requires tons of archaeological and primary source research. The next type of media that is set in history is something that's historical fiction, and this is actually where Assassin's Creed has always operated, for the most part. Even the first Assassin's Creed game takes major historical liberties, especially with the invention of the so-called Apple of Eden and its mythological powers, and then later revealing that it has some connection to aliens and that plot, which not many people were ever interested in, but especially with Desmond and all those things. It definitely was not trying to be a perfect historically accurate take. It had total fantastical elements. So maybe it's not fair to critique Assassin's Creed games as if this is something new, that they've never been historical. However, it is fair to say that Assassin's Creed has been getting way more fictitious than it otherwise was in the past. In fact, these fantasy elements, even embedded and encoded in the combat systems, have become more and more pervasive, which leaves fans of real history like me guessing what's going to come next. Is this actually something that's trying to be inspired by history, or are you just using a historical backdrop to rope people like me in and just tell whatever story you want to tell? People have been nitpicking Assassin's Creed Shadows for the so-called inaccuracies and issues that it has. Fruit being present in the wrong seasons, temples being able to be desecrated, whether or not the main character Yasuke was actually a samurai and in the role that they display him as. These are all potentially fair critiques, but they seem a little imbalanced considering the liberties that the Assassin's Creed franchise has taken in the past. I actually think most of these critiques have been way overstated and way overblown compared to what Ubisoft has gotten away with in the past. It almost seems like the sensationalism of the culture war has put this under the microscope lately, and it's not that Ubisoft doesn't deserve this, and I'm going to explain why. Lastly, we have the final piece of media that's inspired or set in history, which is my personal favorite as a game developer, and that's something that has historical deniability. Historical deniability is actually where I prefer to operate as a game developer. You don't have to be perfectly historically accurate and be bound to only what we have as records. A lot of records are not complete, and you have to fill in the gaps a little bit as a storyteller to make something compelling. You just don't go far enough where you actually contradict existing records or make jumps that are so outlandish that it's obvious that it's not true. For example, I love studying the Crusades. It's what I studied in college. It's one of my favorite subjects, and it's where my game is set, Lionhearts. The interesting thing about the Crusades is you have massive figures, especially in the Third Crusade, such as Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. We have extensive records about these people. We know they existed. We know what they did. And we know what they probably didn't do based on these records. When I'm displaying these characters, it's one thing to say Richard and Saladin might have met in secret. It's not explicitly in the records, but we can deduce that it might have happened. It's probable, or if not probable, plausible that this could have occurred. It's just not recorded. Therefore, a game that depicts a secret meeting between Richard and Saladin is historically deniable, even if it's not historically accurate. It's another step to say that Richard actually didn't go on crusade and he was fighting dragons in Sweden for 10 years. That's not just historically inaccurate, it's historical fiction. We know that didn't happen, and the burden of proof is on you to say that it did, and unless you provide the archaeological and primary source evidence, you're not going to prove it. So importantly, historical deniability cannot go against the records we have. It needs to corroborate with the records. It needs to line up. Another good example is this. You can act as if at this secret meeting, Richard and Saladin were secretly lovers. But there's no corroborating evidence for that. It's much more plausible to state that they met in secret than that they were secretly lovers. And in my opinion, making such an assumption, which many people try to do nowadays, is more ideologically focused than actually historically focused. We need to actually look at the lens of people in history and try to remove ourselves from modern day notions and beliefs to really get a true understanding of how these people acted, behaved, and operated. Otherwise, we're just basically engaging in speculation. Another great example, bringing it back to the Assassin's Creed franchise, is Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Now, when this game came out, I was actually very excited. I love ancient Greece. It's one of my favorite topics of study in history outside of the Crusades. And I love the setting. The world was beautiful, and there were elements of it that I could have enjoyed. What really turned me off to it was just the blatant disrespect and disregard of actual historical facts and settings. It's one thing to make historical fiction inside of a historical world. It's another thing to change the social norms and fabric of that society and still claim that it's historically set. For example, in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, a large percentage of the guards in the game are women. Now, if you know anything about ancient Greece, it's one of the most socially divided by sex society that existed. Women were not allowed or not permitted to engage in these roles. And I think actually you could play devil's advocate from a feminist position and say it's a disservice to women to pretend that they had access to things that they did not. This is simply just ideology. Ubisoft is trying to paint history the way they wish it was, rather than the way it was, which in my opinion is just not the right thing to do. And I think that you lose a lot of respect as an entertainment company when you start to play around with history like that. So let's bring it back to Assassin's Creed Shadows, the subject of this video. Yes, there is a lot of things to critique Ubisoft for lately. They certainly seem to be somewhat compromised in their ideology in the last decade, and that's upsetting to many fans, such as myself. But is the game actually problematic from a historical lens if they're just trying to create another piece of historical fiction, or is this sensationalism? Well, when we examine the actual evidence, which I've taken a look at, it appears that Yasuke was indeed a samurai, and although he was a servant, many servants were samurai. In fact, in Europe, the word knight directly relates to retinue and servant, somebody who serves a lord. Just because you're in a service position does not mean that you're not an actual samurai. Similarly, there's been other media depictions such as Shogun, even recently, where a white man comes to Japan and eventually becomes a samurai, and nobody really scoffed at that. It seems to be just Assassin's Creed Shadows that's coming under scrutiny for this specific point, and I personally think it's unfounded. I don't have gripes with the character choice. Now, you could claim that Ubisoft's already lost the benefit of the doubt, and of course, their first game set in Japan, they choose the only black samurai in history to represent their main character. That is an interesting point, but they have the right to do this. And at the same time, it's not historically implausible. In fact, there are records stating it. So just because he's the main character, you might not like that he's the main character, but there's no historical grounds to deny him as a main character for an Assassin's Creed franchise, especially given their previous installments. Games should be judged based on your goals as a player. If you're just trying to enjoy a game that has some historical dynamics, then Assassin's Creed Shadows and all the other Assassin's Creed games should be right for you. I mean, they're historically set, they have very engaging combat systems, and they've been a staple of the gaming industry for almost 2 decades. If your goal is just to have fun and Assassin's Creed Shadows is fun, then Ubisoft should be praised. We shouldn't be nitpicking Ubisoft over their character choice out of nowhere when we've given them a pass before. In my opinion, some critiques of Assassin's Creed Shadows have been completely overblown. And if we were comparing them to previous installments, they seem to be doing just basically the same thing they've been doing for the last 10 years. However, the cultural shift and the recent failures that Ubisoft has put them under the microscope, and fans are angry. They are very hypercritical, and maybe Ubisoft has lost the benefit of the doubt given how many mistakes they've made in the last few years. At the end of the day, you have to make a choice as a gamer. What do you want out of the game? If you play Assassin's Creed Shadows and you have fun, you shouldn't protest it out of some made-up, historically contrived point. If you just don't like the main character, then don't play the game. Go play a different game. Go play Kingdom Come Deliverance, a game that it takes a lot more pride in actually being historically set and historically accurate. As an indie game development company, Credenzio Studios is trying to strive to make a game that's historically deniable. We can exist within a historical setting without being bound by historical accuracy and so limited that we can't make any changes or adjustments and filling in the gaps, which is what we're going to do. In fact, our up-and-coming Lionhearts project, which is going to have a Kickstarter soon, is going to try its best to make you feel like you're in a historical world. It's a plausible historical world. Yes, you're making choices. Yes, you're going to do things that historical characters didn't do, and that's going to change the world around you in a way that didn't actually happen. But it's historically deniable, and it's historically plausible. And most importantly, this Kickstarter needs support, and if you'd like to support it, please consider helping us and subscribing to our email chain to keep an update on our campaign. We love history, we love making historical games, and we hope we can provide one that you guys will enjoy. Hey, did you like that content? Please consider liking and subscribing. We're going to be continuing to make videos like this, talking about our up-and-coming game, talking about games and media, movies, cinema, all sorts of things that we enjoy discussing here at Credenzio Studios. So if you like this content, like, subscribe, and come back for more. Thanks.